Utilitarianism, Part 2, John Stuart Mill. Recall some of the objections to utilitarianism that Sandel listed. Chief among these was Bentham's instrumentalist view of individual liberty. Freedom was seen as good only insofar as people were happier when they were free to do as they will. Sandel also levels the charge that reducing goodness or justice to pleasure flattens the moral landscape. Another problem leveled against utilitarianism is one that is common to all consequentialist theories, that is, theories where morality of action is judged by the outcomes rather than the intent. That is, that acting in such a way that immediately brings about maximal pleasure in the short term can work against pleasure in the long term. There are four choices when philosophical theories run counter to our pre-philosophical intuitions. One is to argue our intuitions are misplaced, or come up with something different, or synthesize two or more theories. Finally, one can modify the theory one has to meet the objections. Mill was a utilitarian who modified his theory. Mill lived from 1806 to 1873. His father, James Mill, was a disciple of Bentham, and Mill followed in his father's footsteps. Mill was also godfather to Bertrand Russell, himself a noted philosopher and public intellectual of the early and mid-20th century. Besides being one of the most brilliant minds of the 19th century England, making contributions to social theory, political philosophy, and the philosophy of science, Mill was also a politician and social reformer, as was his mentor, Jeremy Bentham. At a fairly early age, Mill suffered bouts of depression and became discouraged with the entire project of reforming society. While recovering, he found Bentham's psychological formulation of utilitarianism to be too limited and became keenly aware of the social aspect of what it is to be human. When it comes to freedom, Mill attempts to flip the script, as it were. On the one hand, he still agrees with Bentham that freedom is a matter of following one's inclinations. However, individual liberty is not simply one source of pleasure among others, but it is a guarantor of pleasure in general. Mill argues that liberty is fundamental to a just society. Take a look at the quote in the slide. Notice how much more individual freedom Mill allows than Bentham. Look at the following scenario. A police officer finds a homeless person in the park. There is no rule that the homeless person can't be in the park, and the person isn't bothering anyone. On the other hand, it is very cold. The officer suggests that the homeless person go to a shelter, but the homeless person refuses to go. After much discussion, the officer finds that the homeless person is of sound mind, even though that person is clearly uncomfortable and may be in danger of getting sick and would be better off out of the elements. Bentham would say that the general welfare demands that the homeless person be made safe and comfortable. Mill would counter that the officer should respect the homeless person's wishes. Freedom of opportunity is also important to Mill, and particularly education, because the educated mind is better able to discern the value of various pleasures. Also note that individual freedom is so important to Mill that the general welfare cannot come at the expense of depriving liberty to a few. Mill does this by significantly changing the utilitarian maxim. Bentham was content to say that an action which produces the greatest pleasure in the here and now was good enough. Mill takes a longer view. Notice that he is looking at probabilities. One cannot know all the consequences of one's actions, but one can calculate probable outcomes. So instead of deciding on an action, Mill would have us first devise a rule. Mill's ethics is about generating general principles to be used as a guide. Mill also has a more nuanced view of pleasure. Pleasures are not of all one kind. According to Sandel, Bentham would argue that if watching NASCAR gave as much pleasure as listening to Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, then they are equally good. Mill would counter that some pleasures are more refined than others, even though not everyone derives the same degree of pleasure from these more refined forms. Some pleasures lead to an expansion of one's character, and that we can form a consensus about what we ought to take pleasure in. In some ways, Mill wants his cake and eat it too. His full-throated defense of liberty is so strong that it supports utility and not the other way around. The principle of liberty is not a utilitarian principle. It is smuggled in. Bentham declared that from a utilitarian point of view, the idea of human rights is so much nonsense. It doesn't matter that Mill argues that liberty is necessary to secure utility. Without the same sort of objective, measurable standard that Bentham proposed, Mill's view of liberty looks very much as if Mill has utilitarianism on the same wobbly stilts of natural rights that Bentham ridiculed. Sandel suggests that one could construct a plausible society without the sort of liberty that Mill has in mind, one that is on the whole happy, one where social cohesion is more important than individual liberty. There is literary evidence for this in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. If you haven't read this, you should take the time. It is a dystopian society that is almost the polar opposite of 1984. Without giving away the plot, Huxley outlines a society characterized by consumerism, sex, drugs, pleasures of all sorts, and one where people are genetically engineered to genuinely enjoy their various occupations, no matter how grand or menial. Pleasures, gross and refined, are enjoyed by all who are capable of being susceptible to them. Being engineered by biology and society, citizens lack the sort of freedom that Mill holds to be necessary. He might find such a society appalling, but it illustrates that his utilitarian principles are not sufficient for liberty and that he has no utilitarian argument to oppose the society of the Brave New World. The same can be said about how Mill treats pleasure. Even if we were to take a poll and decide what we ought to have pleasure in, we only have a halfway house of objectivity. Why should the movie of, say, 2001 be more refined than that of Star Trek or the Star Wars franchises? Why should the majority decide what any one of us ought to like? By extension, Mill is assuming that being well cultivated is a great good by appealing to something other than its utility. On the one hand, Mill does not reduce ethics and the just distribution of goods to psychology as Bentham does, and his conclusions seem to accord with our intuition about human dignity. His defense of liberty seems more robust than Bentham's. On the other hand, Mill's theory is not as straightforward as that of Bentham. It is harder to come to ethical judgments about undecided issues. Mill's theory also does not hang together as well as Bentham's. He has too many supports that just hang in the air. Mill isn't as egalitarian as Bentham. For all its attractive features, Sandel finds Mill wanting. Is there a way to shore up individual liberty without demolishing the edifice that Bentham has constructed? Next time, we will look at a theory where liberty does find justification that is not on stilts. When reading the next chapter, think about whether the idea of the greater good or general welfare come into play at all.